Growing up, I've always been the crybaby and been told over and over again that I'm too sensitive and cry too much. And if that sounds like you, then this video is for you. So when I came across the highly sensitive person framework in early 2022, my inner child felt this massive sense of relief, since it was really the first time that he felt seen and felt like he just had the permission to just be himself. But notice I refer to my inner child as he and not me. And that's because I only held onto the HSP label for a total of probably around 1 week before I actually completely forgot about it and moved on from the framework. And that's honestly because in 2021, I processed and healed a big portion of my childhood traumas through my own self-therapizing and actually started my own spiritual awakening path. So actually, when I came across the Highly Sensitive Person book by Elaine Aron, it felt more like a validator of what I've already processed already, and recognized that actually clinging onto this label would be probably detrimental for me and prevent me from deepening my spiritual practices. So today I want to use my own story as well as cultural influences and childhood trauma frameworks to help you understand the stages of being an HSP, and also how you can use your gift that's been repeatedly discredited by others since you were a child to really uncover the incredibly healing and spiritual powers. If you're new to my channel, welcome. Thank you for being here. I talk about anything and everything holistically to help you discover your potentials. I want to touch on this topic because 1, I exhibit and experience many HSP traits, and 2, I'm cautiously wary of how the labels of HSP and also the more popularized cousin label of empath is gaining mainstream traction in a similar way that more extreme mental health issues are online. And just as a quick disclaimer, if I say mental health issue or disorder, I'm referring to as how clinical psychology refers to them. I really deep down don't believe anyone has inherent flaws or issues, and believe that most of the time diagnoses are actually more harmful for people. So to me, the most jarring ones are narcissism and bipolar, where I'll include screenshots here of just how massively commercially popular topics they have become despite of how rare they are. So I think it's really important to note this because as psychology continues to be more embedded in the psyche of how we make sense of ourselves, they can easily become another pop culture phenomenon like astrology or the Myers-Briggs. And the labels can easily become scapegoated for people not to actually resolve their own issues. So for example, I know there are nuances between the popular term empath and HSP, but for demonstrative purposes, wanted to mention this Vice article titled, "Why is everyone I know an empath now?" where psychotherapist Canovella explains the popularity of this phenomenon, saying, "It sounds like there's this inherent difficulty in being an empath. If you have a piece of your identity that's kind of a painful thing, then it makes a ton of sense that you would look for support, and that there may be some perceived stigma as a result. Maybe feeling like you're not understood because you're an empath and you have these experiences and people can't really relate to them, and it might feel lonely." So to me, what's really happening is that being an HSP or an empath by trade in our society, especially in Western society, still continues to be looked down on and dismissed because the majority of people are just threatened by our sensitivities and vulnerabilities. So coming across a framework like HSP becomes massively gratifying and safe for us to identify with when most of our lives we've been dismissed or repressed of our sensibilities. And Dr. Elaine Aron in her HSP book explicitly states that being the HSP does not mean that you're a better person, and that this really is just another framework for us to help understand ourselves. But I think because in a time when people are trying to reclaim their wounded past left and right, the HSP label, in my opinion, has become another form of tribalism and psychology that really covers up our actual true gifts to break free from our childhood traumas. So how do we get here? For my own healing and spiritual practices, I wanted to introduce the 4 R's framework that has massively helped me on my own healing path and also can be applied here for HSPs. The 4 R's goes from rejection to rage identification, reclaiming, and healing and release. And like any framework, this by no means captures everyone's experiences and may not progress linearly at all for some, but it's really something that I've observed for myself and also for many who are also on their own healing journeys. So I'll dive into what each stage encompasses specifically for HSPs and how you can use it to your own understanding. The first stage of rejection starts from our childhood when our caregivers, our immediate environments, including the school and also our peers, invalidate our experiences as an HSP. In the Western context where the mainstream ideology is capitalistic salvation, we have prescribed traits of what a successful person looks like, and this often looks like someone who is outgoing, confident, master slave of emotions, ambitious, and action-oriented. Someone who is like a rugged individualist, and as Elaine Aron states herself, "What is the ideal in our culture? Movies, advertisements, the design of public spaces all tell us we should be as tough as the Terminator, as stoic as Clint Eastwood, and as outgoing as Goldie Hawn. We should be pleasantly stimulated by bright lights, noise, a gang of cheerful fellows hanging out in a bar. If you're feeling overwhelmed and sensitive, we can always take a painkiller." So right off the bat, we're born into an environment that does not value our subtleties and sensitivities and becomes the basis of our own traumas. So say even if a primary caregiver is an HSP him or herself, which was the case for my mother, unless they completely removed themselves ourselves and we're actually going against the ideology of society, it is strongly likely that as HSPs we were not properly mirrored, and hence as children we grew up to have issues with overstimulation, anxieties, depressions, and etc. To just backtrack a little, mirroring in child development psychology is a concept of a caregiver copying and reflecting the child's body, language, and speech and facial expression as a way of signaling to the child that their experiences are seen, that their existence is valid, and that they're connected to their caregiver. So this is really important because if as HSPs we're not mirrored sufficiently and our sensitivities induced by our overstimulation or our strong empathetic abilities were rejected, then we grow up to internalize the rejection of those HSP traits and actually find them to be quite shameful. So in my experience, that's a loud noise from my ego always telling myself to just stop crying, to stop being so easily affected and moved by things. As a result, I actually developed a hard shell exterior that prevented me from being introspective and redirected my empathy to just reading other people. Jasmine Lee, author of The Emotionally Absent Mother, further expands on this mirroring concept, stating that the basic message of I see you is modified by the tone involved. It can be I see you and you are good, or I see you and you are bad. The first we might call the admiring mirror. The second could be considered a shaming mirror. A admiring mirror helps us stand tall, feel proud of ourselves, feel that we have the right to be here and it's good that we're here. So too often, because society prizes a really stoic and disassociated person who is averse to our subtleties and sensitivities, we carry this inherent belief that our HSP traits are deep down a burden, something that we should be ashamed of. And because the outside world and our family, whether knowingly or not, rejects us, we also learn to reject that part of ourselves. So it obviously doesn't feel good to carry the sense of rejection, and when we stumble across a framework like HSP, it can really feel like stumbling upon a pot of gold on the other side of the rainbow and a sacred way of feeling seen. And that's when the second stage of rage identification comes into play. I think identification in all shapes or form is very natural because we as humans are born into this world kind of confused of why our brains can think so much. And so basically any intellectual or conceptual labels we find that resonates with us, we really want to hold on to. But rage identification for me is that overcompensation of identifying with the label as a response to being rejected all our lives. So when we stumble across frameworks like HSP and as a result experience this flood of validation that we've never experienced before as a result of poor mirroring growing up, it's kind of like turning our backs against societies to those who have hurt us and channeling that hurt through angrily holding onto labels that make us feel seen. And I'm not dismissing the importance of this stage because perhaps this is the first time in your life that actually you've been told that nothing is wrong with you. And the framework becomes a large mirror to reflect and affirm you when you've been told otherwise all your life. So this HSP mirror becomes your new compass, your new ethos that you identify with. And in the most extreme cases, for example, you might end up in an environment that is actually overstimulating you and you blame the environment for the cause while not necessarily examining why you're feeling overstimulated in the first place. The rage becomes some sort of protective mechanism because your inner child has experienced so many years of invalidation and rejection of love for who you are, and the HSP label becomes a sanctuary that makes you feel safe and a place that you can really find refuge in the cold stoic world. If it's easier to understand, I almost think of it as the HSP being just that teenager who is growing into their own skin and discovering parts of them that their parents rejected and really finding their own sub or counterculture to make sense of the world. But in the context of HSPs, when we start identifying with the label, we can also start realizing that we are still being repeatedly feeling overstimulated and controlled by our emotions due to our inherent natures that is actually not serving us. And this is when reclaiming and healing work becomes absolutely critical so we can quote unquote adult into our HSP nature as something that can actually help us grieve our past of being rejected as a HSP. So my rule of thumb is that if you still have emotional or behavioral responses that make you automatically anxious, sad, or angry, then there's probably still some trauma work you have to do. It might sound like a massive generalization, but if we were truly all healed and perfect from our own traumas, then any sort of suffering would not exist, and quite frankly would also not exist as well. And Dr. Elaine Aron also makes this explicit, saying that HSPs are more affected by a troubled childhood than that they are more depressed and anxious as adults. Since, as we all know, we pick up subtle signals much easier than others, and any response or a stimulant becomes that much more easily traumatic for us. So having a conceptual framework or label to identify with is great, but it's also way too tempting as humans with our black and white thinking and scapegoat labels as this is just how it is and therefore I don't need to do anything about it. But from my own experience and just generally observing the social media space, that obviously has its own detriments, and being able to reclaim our identity therefore means being able to heal our wounds as an HSP that many times leaves us victims of our own emotions and actually our empathy. And healing work may look like actually developing tougher skin so that we're not easily affected in this world, or developing emotional mastery so we don't become controlled by our overfeeling and overstimulating tendencies. And I want to emphasize that I'm not diminishing our needs to have a label, but a reliance on labels does mean leaning into our traumas that inhibit us from being peaceful and happy, and actually giving that stamp of approval approval of how we were inadequately raised to avoid that personal responsibility. But the good news is, as HSP, we in fact do have a gift not to just empathize with others, but ultimately with ourselves. And I'll go into how we can rechannel this reclaiming for our own healing journey in the second half of the video. Which brings us to the final stage of release, which is releasing ourselves free of the HSP label, still being able to resonate with it, but no longer needing it to define us. And many times that does come in tandem with spiritual work. As Elaine noted herself, many HSPs have a natural inclination towards spirituality, where in a 1992 gathering of HSPs, many participants quoted various practices like meditation, yoga, spiritual disciplines like Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and yes, even Christianity, as a response to their sensitivities to forces and energies outside of what non-HSP people consider to be just illogical or overly sensitive behavior. And so for many spiritual disciplines, the ultimate realization comes down to experiencing a world outside of just you being you, and being able to see past the division of a dual world which dictates good and evil and you versus me. I won't really focus on this too heavily in this video because I did want to focus more on the reclaiming and healing aspect, but basically part of the release means being able to take that healed and reclaimed self, finding gratitude for it, and letting go of that wholeness to realize the ultimate sense of peace that the spiritual world embodies. And I think here it's also interesting to note that this quote-unquote stage can actually be quite powerful when used in tandem with the healing process. So being able to channel the spiritual practices to help you more massively work in partnership with your emotions and over-arousal rather than being ruled by them, actually using the grieving process to also release our inner child's wounds. And ultimately with this release, your full gift as a HSP will be realized, and you can use that gift to also help heal and enlighten other people. So now that you have a better understanding of the stages, I wanted to touch on the burdens of identifying as a HSP and how those beautiful gifts that you are born with can actually help you in your healing inner work and also beyond. So the most pressing burden is overstimulated because of HSP's ability to pick up the subtle details and information in the world. I think here it's important to distinguish how we can reclaim and heal from this burden by first distinguishing between overarousal and overstimulation. Elaine Aron stated herself that remember that overarousal is not necessarily fear. Where in my own words and opinion, overarousal is in taking too much information at once, whereas the more classic definition of overstimulated is taking too much information at once and being overwhelmed by your fears. So sometimes if you can't immediately decipher between the two because maybe both are actually present, then it might be helpful for you to ask yourself, am I over-aroused or am I scared or both? To me, the burden of over-arousal is a healing practice of setting boundaries. In a world where honestly, majority of people are really dissociated from their emotions and how they're feeling, being an HSP in a desensitized world means that your nervous system is actually being protected of you. So for some non-HSPs, they may not even be cognizant or aware that they're being overwhelmed and need to rest because maybe their nervous systems or their own childhood wounds are not picking up the subtle signals. But for us as HSPs, the overarousal is actually reminding us to set our boundaries and focus on self-care. So for example, if you had a long day at work and let's say stop and happy hour to go to, then your overarousal is reminding you to cap your time spent at the happy hour. Or for example, if you're around triggering family members, then giving yourself the permission to cut short family stays or getting the habit of excusing yourself and making it clear that you need your own space. Rather than viewing the overarousal as an excuse for you to just avoid the world altogether, the healing from this means that still engaging with the world, but knowing that your nervous system has its guardrails to keep you in check, and when the alarm starts going off, to listen to it and honor your own need for safety and groundedness. So some other healing habits after you set your boundaries could be simple breath work, going for a walk in nature, listening to some calming music, or whatever form of self-care practice that allows you to utilize your overarousal towards your own peace. And when overarousal falls into a territory of overwhelm and fear, then the burden of overstimulated becomes a healing practice of troubleshooting. I think when we grow up and see our friends, families, and peers so dissociated from their inner sensitivities, it can really reinforce that shame that perhaps we are weak and fragile because we cannot handle the amount of noise in the world. But what we may just believe subconsciously to be a weakness can actually be a way to reclaim that power when we use those cries of fear to help troubleshoot where we may still have unresolved traumas or issues that we need to work through. So one of the most jarring experiences for me growing up is how I can easily spot other people's problems and be able to look at their behaviors and circumstances and kind of being like, duh, that's a problem. But for them, it's not obvious at all. And that's because our tendency to become overstimulated is actually constantly troubleshooting for us on what feels wrong and what feels right, and really gives us the pointers to the underlying fears it's nudging us to confront. So back to that work and happy hour example, besides just the overarousal, perhaps the loud bar and the large crowd, what is your overstimulated inner child telling you? Perhaps you still have underlying fears being in a social setting and unwillingness to open yourself up to others because you've been told all your life that your sensitive traits are not valued. Those fear alarms are always for HSPs to lean into and take those fear-driven messages and reclaim them as loving and actually nourishing reminder to examine and confront our fears. And this is not something that everyone was blessed with, when some people might actually live their whole lives plagued by their own fears and not actually being conscious of it. In this case, your overstimulation is in some blunt way giving you the answers loud and clear to your own healing path. So listen to those overstimulated cries, examine what is directing you to work through, and journal about it, and you'll find that your HSP burden of overstimulation has actually been a healing guide for you all along. Being an HSP means strong degrees of empathy, and that can easily transform to the burden of excessively feeling others' emotions and actually as a result deplete our own inner wealth. And I think one of the most common ways this manifests in HSPs is that we become that go-to person for others to lean on for advice, because HSPs are often trusted advisors who are capable of listening deeply and having strong sense of compassion for what others are going through. But depending on the capacity you have to hold onto the depth of others' emotional world, this can actually become a burden for you to carry when you feel like others' problems and sorrows weigh down on you and take on a codependent role in friendships and relationships. So on the most surface level, if you are affected by this burden, then it's another form of boundary setting practice where at times healing from it does mean developing a tougher skin, and in more of a HSP perspective, giving yourself the permission to turn off your empathy out of your own emotional health. And it's not that you don't care, but it's actually reclaiming your own sensitivity and being able to decide when to be empathetic and when not to, rather than just defaulting to feeling it out for others and being affected by it. But I think another more pressing burden is how feeling or even doing that emotional work for others actually depletes our own emotional world, and we're not aware that it may be a trauma response. I really don't think enough people talk about this in the scheme of HSPs, but part of not being able to set that boundary of empathy many times is a survival mechanism we develop as children that in our raging identification stage we might just take as normal. If your needs were not being met as a child, where you weren't mirrored in an admiring way sufficiently that helps you affirm your sensitivity as a gift, then you actually redirect your empathy to mirror your caretakers to gain their approval. And over time, you learn how to maximize your empathetic skills for your own survival, perhaps to please the parents so you ensure you get the basic necessities like food and attention. So that could be in the context of growing up with parents with narcissistic tendencies, you being parentified as a child, or just generally emotionally absent or repressive parents whose emotional deficits attune your heightened sense of sensitivity so you aren't threatened with abandonment and no love. So how that may show up is that you may be incredibly skillful at reading the room because you've had to walk on eggshells all your life, but because your empathy has been so directed heavily towards survival by reading others, you are actually the most out of touch with yourself. I personally struggled with this when I was going through my own self-therapizing, where I've always labeled myself as a very perceptive and attuned kid because I grew up in a family system where my emotional health was not prioritized and constantly felt like I needed to read the room to stay safe and not be scolded. So I held tightly onto this capacity to empathize with others because it was what kept me out of trouble at home, but at the cost that I actually never had in-depth knowledge of my own feelings because other people's emotions always took power and precedence over mine. And as humans, we only have so much bandwidth to process thoughts and emotions, so as HSPs, we may find ourselves occupied by how others are feeling rather than redirecting that sensitivity to our own good. But as part of reclaiming this coping mechanism meant redirecting my empathy for my own repressed and wounded self, and it has been one of the most powerful and healing gifts I've ever encountered. Using that empathy that I had for others and applying to myself was what allowed me to process through 25 years of trauma in a short few months without a therapist, because I was actually using my sensitivity to guide me, letting it troubleshoot for me. And one of my favorite quotes by a Buddhist teacher is, "Use what may seem like poison as medicine." Where utilizing my own poison of being consumed by my empathy for others was actually the ultimate saving grace and medicine to help me break free from my childhood trauma. I think naturally for us to carry that burden of being able to empathize with so many people makes us feel like we don't really belong in an insensitive and apathetic world. But since that's out of our control, what we can focus on is redirecting that to ourselves, healing that internalized rejection we felt during identification, and healing ourselves to our deepest shadows. And after that, when we've allowed ourselves to finally be selfish for once, to use our empathy as our own healer, then we can even actually better help others in a more selfless and less codependent way. The last burden I want to touch on is the burden of being misunderstood. We talked about it extensively in the social cultural context that being the HSP often means being rejected in many ways since birth. And you might be wondering what actually being understood looks like if grasping onto the HSP label isn't necessarily good for our own peace. And that is when doing the inner healing work in tandem with spiritual practices actually becomes a source of feeling connected with others. If you were like me, growing up, I always felt like an outsider amongst my friends, my peers, and my family. And in my opinion, having that raging identification phase as a HSP is incredibly validating and important, but actually also another source to alienate yourself. It subconsciously creates that I'm so different emotional barrier that really reinforces a sense of loneliness from being rejected all your life. So channeling your sensitivity to spiritual practices is helping you reclaim the access to higher realms of consciousness and connectivity, because growing up you probably weren't allowed to stay in touch with those more esoteric experiences, so you had to abandon them. So as you do your own healing work, memories of more out-of-the-world experiences may start coming back to you, and spiritual work may start appealing to you, and those are all pointers for a rich spiritual path ahead. For me, when I worked through my own traumas by redirecting the empathy towards myself, I accidentally triggered my own spiritual awakening, and this was the first time I embraced and really felt that vast love for anyone and everyone that many spiritual disciplines teach. It's what's commonly known as the bliss stage, where everything feels so wonderful and beautiful, but of course it really doesn't last forever. But it does become an outlet and a channel for me to experience that connectivity that really transcends my senses of self, my isolations, and my understandings. And obviously that will be different for every person, but really leaning into your healing, your intuitions, and your empathy that may have felt like a burden and a source of loneliness all your life will actually become your gateway to a radically more connected world. One of the most groundbreaking learnings for me was being able to see past the dual thinking of black and white and you versus me, and actually recognizing that all labels just really operate at a spectrum. And in the case for HSPs, that everyone actually has some degree of sensitivity in them, just some more so than others. And even then, there are 15 to 20% of the population that may be considered HSPs as well. And as part of releasing that label means recognizing the seeds of sensitivity in others and also learning the merits of non-HSPs and sensitivities. So we can water other people's seeds of empathy while learning from others on how to actually healthily stand up for our needs and setting clearer boundaries, and as a result connect with others that we thought we really needed to alienate as part of our identification process. So in short, the burden of being misunderstood becomes a release of that sense of being wronged and actually being able to find the healing powers to connect with literally anyone you wish to. Thank you, friends, for watching this video. I really hope understanding HSP from a social, cultural, self, and spiritual level will help you with your own healing and reclaiming path. If you feel obliged to do so, please give this video a thumbs up and also greatly appreciate a subscribe. And until then, take care.